Hey everybody, and welcome back to Historicalish. This is the World War II Mysteries and Oddities Iceberg. This is part 2 of Tier 3. So, let's jump right in. First up on the list, we have the Fugo balloon bombs. So, the Fugo balloon bombs were this kind of odd weapon that Japan tried to use against the United States during World War II. These balloon bombs, or fire balloons, were part of Japan's secretive plan to attack North America by harnessing the power of high-altitude winds to carry explosive balloons across the Pacific Ocean. Now, while they ultimately had a minimal impact overall, the Fugo campaign does still remain a fascinating example of unconventional warfare. So in 1944, as Japan faced mounting losses in the Pacific theater, Japanese scientists and military strategists sought new ways to strike at the United States, which they hoped would demoralize the American public. Japanese researchers discovered that during the winter months, strong eastward air currents, what we now know as the jet stream, could carry objects across the Pacific from Japan to North America in just a matter of days. With this knowledge, the Japanese army developed the Fugo balloon bombs. Each balloon was made from lightweight paper or rubberized silk and filled with hydrogen. The balloons measured about 33 feet in diameter and carried a payload of approximately 33 pounds of incendiary and anti-personnel explosives. So the Fugo balloons were designed to travel along the jet stream at altitudes of around 30,000 feet. A sophisticated altitude control mechanism used sandbag weights and pressure sensors to keep the balloons at a relatively stable altitude. When the balloon dipped below a certain level, the ballast would be released to allow it to rise again. Once all the sandbags were dropped, a fuse was ignited, releasing the bombs, and the balloon would eventually self-destruct. Between November 1944 and April of 1945, Japan launched over 9,000 Fugo balloons from the coast of Honshu, aiming them at the western United States and Canada. Japanese planners hoped the bombs would cause widespread forest fires, damage infrastructure, and create just a general panic among civilians. While most of the balloons likely fell into the Pacific Ocean, around 300 were reported to have reached North America, spanning areas from Alaska to Mexico and as far east as Michigan. The Fugo balloons caused limited damage, but did actually result in one incident. On May 5, 1945, a group of picnickers near Bly, Oregon, came across one of the downed balloons. When they attempted to investigate, it exploded, killing 6 people, including 5 children and a pregnant woman named Elsie Mitchell. This was the only instance during World War II where enemy action directly caused civilian deaths on the U.S. mainland. While the balloons did start a few small fires, these were quickly contained by forest rangers, and no large-scale damage or significant panic resulted from the campaign. And once the U.S. military became aware of the balloons, they implemented countermeasures to minimize their impact. Fighter pilots were trained to intercept balloons, and radar stations monitored the skies for possible threats. The U.S. Forest Service also remained vigilant, and authorities advised the public to avoid any strange objects they may find. So, all in all, Japan eventually halted the Fugo campaign, partly due to resource constraints and partly because the lack of visible success. The strategy was ultimately deemed ineffective, especially as the war began to wind down following the U.S. capture of Iwo Jima and the ongoing bombings of Japan. Next on the list, we have the Big Stoop Plane. The Big Stoop Plane refers to a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, famously known for an incident where they essentially sank a train during World War II. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress was one of the primary heavy bombers used by the U.S. Army Air Forces during World War II. The B-17 was a mainstay in bombing campaigns all over Europe and the Pacific. While the plane's typical targets included military installations, factories, and other strategic infrastructure, the story of the Big Stoop's famous bombing mission was interesting because it went after a train. The incident reportedly took place during a bombing raid over Europe, possibly around 1943 or 1944. So accounts vary slightly, but the general story is that the B-17, nicknamed Big Stoop, was en route to its designated target when the crew noticed a German train moving along a bridge. Seizing the opportunity, the pilot decided to engage the train as a secondary target. In a very unusual maneuver, the crew of Big Stoop conducted a very precise low-altitude bombing run on the moving train. According to legend, one of the bombs struck the bridge just as the train was passing over it, causing a dramatic explosion and sinking the train into the river or valley below. So whether every detail of the Big Stoop story is true remains quite uncertain, as it's primarily preserved through anecdotal accounts from veterans. But it's pretty cool nonetheless. 3,000 lost Chinese soldiers. The story of the 3,000 lost Chinese soldiers refers to a mysterious event during the Second Sino-Japanese War, where an entire regiment of Chinese soldiers reportedly vanished without a trace. So the Second Sino-Japanese War, which began in 1937 and later merged into the broader conflict of World War II, was very brutal, and it was a devastating conflict between Japan and China. Both sides suffered massive casualties, with the war characterized by brutal ground battles, guerrilla warfare, and harsh environmental conditions. So, according to legend, sometime during the war, a regiment of 3,000 Chinese soldiers was stationed in a mountainous region to defend a critical strategic point against advancing Japanese forces. They were positioned in rugged, isolated terrain and were expected to hold their ground as long as possible. When reinforcements arrived at the regiment's location, they found no trace of the soldiers. Equipment and supplies were left as if the troops had abandoned their posts, but no signs of a struggle, battle, or retreat were apparent. Various reports suggest that Japanese soldiers also came upon the abandoned site and were equally perplexed. Despite exhaustive searches by both Chinese and Japanese forces, no evidence was found of where the regiment went. It was essentially as if the entire unit had simply vanished overnight. Obviously, if 3,000 people disappear overnight, it's not an insignificant event, so there have been some theories that have come out, but obviously none have been definitively proven. Some suggest that the soldiers may have fallen victim to environmental factors such as landslides, floods, or even sudden severe weather that have quickly buried them in the mountainous terrain. Given the harsh and unpredictable environment, it is possible that they were swept away or buried without a trace, although the lack of physical evidence still puzzles researchers. Another theory states that these soldiers may have been captured by Japanese forces in an ambush. However, given the size of the regiment, it seems unlikely that such a large force could have been taken without leaving evidence or a trail. The regiment could have also just disbanded or deserted due to low morale, a common issue among troops during the grueling conditions of the Sino-Japanese War. If the soldiers dispersed into the wilderness or small local villages to avoid capture or death, they might have effectively disappeared from official records, though 3,000 individuals would be incredibly hard to hide. Locals do say that they think that they were swallowed by the mountain, but some historians believe that the story was essentially exaggerated or mythologized over time. In the chaos of war, rumors and ghost stories often develop as people seek explanations for losses and tragedies. So nobody really knows, but yeah, moving on. The Luck of Kokura. The Luck of Kokura refers to a twist of fate that spared the Japanese city from being the target of the second atomic bomb dropped by the United States. The planned bombing on Kokura was ultimately redirected to Nagasaki due to unusual and persistent cloud cover, which saved the city from devastation and left it with the reputation as the luckiest city in Japan. After the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the United States planned a second bombing to compel Japan to surrender. The intended target was Kokura, a major industrial city on Japan's southern island of Kyushu, and home to the Kokura Arsenal, a significant military complex that produced weapons and ammunitions and all that fun stuff for the Japanese army. The B-29 bomber Boxcar, piloted by Major Charles Sweeney, carried the second atomic bomb, codenamed Fat Man, destined for Kokura on August 9, 1945. The crew's orders specified Kokura as the primary target, with Nagasaki designated as a secondary target if conditions were unsuitable. As Boxcar approached Kokura, however, the city was obscured by clouds. This unanticipated cloud cover, combined with smoke from nearby Yawata, another city that had been bombed earlier, obscured the Kokura arsenal from view. At the time, the U.S. military protocol required visual confirmation of the target before dropping an atomic bomb, as radar bombing was deemed too risky for such a powerful weapon. Sweeney's crew made 3 separate passes over Kokura, each time hoping for a break in the clouds to allow a clear shot at the city. After each pass, the clouds continued to cover the target, making a precise drop impossible. And with fuel running low and time running out, Major Sweeney was forced to abandon Kokura as the final target and head for Nagasaki, the secondary target. When they arrived, clouds initially covered Nagasaki as well, but a break in the clouds eventually allowed the crew to drop the bomb. The atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki, causing widespread destruction and killing an estimated 40,000 to 75,000 people instantly. Kokura's escape from atomic devastation became known as the Luck of Kokura. And has since become an iconic example of how minor factors can alter the course of history. Next up, we have the Dirlewanger Brigade. The Dirlewanger Brigade, officially known as the 36th Waffen Grenadier Division of the SS, was one of the most infamous and brutal Nazi units during World War II. Led by Oskar Dirlewanger, the unit became notorious for its extreme violence and atrocities against civilians, especially in Eastern Europe. Composed of violent criminals, concentration camp inmates, and later political prisoners and collaborators, the Dirlewanger Brigade earned a reputation for indiscriminate brutality, even by the grim standards of the SS, which, that's saying something. The Dirlewanger Brigade was formed in 1940 by Oskar Dirlewanger, an SS officer and former World War I veteran who had a reputation for cruelty. Dirlewanger was a convicted felon with a history of violent behavior and had served time in prison for sexual assault and poaching. His connections within the SS hierarchy, especially with Heinrich Himmler, allowed him to secure a position in the Nazi war effort despite his criminal record. Initially, the unit was composed of poachers who Himmler believed would be skilled at tracking and hunting guerrilla fighters. Over time, however, the unit expanded to include violent criminals, concentration camp prisoners, and political prisoners deemed unreliable by the Nazi state. By 1944, even more desperate conscripts, including Soviet POWs, anti-communist volunteers, and others viewed as expendable, were added to the brigade. The Dirlewanger Brigade became infamous for its extreme violence and lack of discipline. They were known for drunkenness and looting, and the unit's atrocities shocked even other SS and German military officers who actually filed complaints about Dirlewanger's methods. They were deployed mostly in Belarus and Poland, with anti-guerrilla operations in Belarus and the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. I won't go too much into what they did. I want this video to stay up. So if you're interested in this, do your own research. But all in all, by 1945, the brigade was effectively destroyed in combat in Eastern Germany. The surviving members were either captured by Soviet forces or fled, and Dirlewanger himself was eventually arrested by French forces after the war. He was placed in a prison camp where he was reportedly beaten to death by Polish guards or former concentration camp inmates who were in custody. So yeah, moving on. The escape from Sobibor. The escape from Sobibor was one of the most extraordinary and successful uprisings by prisoners in a Nazi extermination camp during the Holocaust. Sobibor, located in occupied Poland, was one of the Nazi regime's most secretive death camps, designed solely for the purpose of mass extermination. On October 14, 1943, a group of Jewish prisoners orchestrated a rebellion and escape that led hundreds to flee, though only a fraction ultimately survived the war. Sobibor was established in March 1942 as part of Operation Reinhard, the Nazi campaign to systematically exterminate Polish Jews. The camp was isolated, surrounded by barbed wire and minefields, and heavily guarded. Sobibor's purpose was not forced labor or imprisonment, but simply just mass murder. Victims were brought in on trains and sent directly to gas chambers under the guise of relocation. Approximately 250,000 Jews were murdered at Sobibor over its operation. Unlike other camps, there was little infrastructure for long-term survival, and most arrivals were killed within hours. A small number of prisoners were kept alive to perform tasks for the Nazis, such as sorting valuables, cleaning the chambers, and maintaining the camp in general. By 1943, Sobibor prisoners became aware of the Nazis' plan to exterminate all witnesses, meaning their lives were in constant jeopardy. A group of prisoners began planning an escape, despite the camp's tight security and obviously the risk of death. The plan gained momentum with the arrival of Alexander Sasha Pechersky, a Soviet Jewish POW and Red Army officer, in September of 1943. Pechersky's military experience and leadership skills provided the prisoners with a sense of hope, and he quickly took on a central role in organizing the uprising. Together with another prisoner, Leon Feldhelder, Pechersky devised a escape plan that involved both killing key SS officers and overpowering guards. The plan was to lure and kill key SS officers one by one in a series of ambushes. By eliminating the camp's leadership, they hoped to disrupt the camp's order and minimize the number of guards they would face during the escape. Their ultimate goal was to disable the camp's defenses and overwhelm the guards, creating enough confusion for a large group of prisoners to flee through the minefields surrounding the camp. On October 14th, the uprising began, where throughout the afternoon, small groups of prisoners ambushed SS officers, luring them into isolated areas under pretexts like needing assistance with repairs. By the time the main escape attempt began, The prisoners had successfully killed 11 SS officers and guards. The remaining guards quickly realized something was wrong, leading to a chaotic scramble as prisoners tried to escape through the camp's gates and fences. Some prisoners cut through barbed wire, while others scrambled over fences. In the ensuing chaos, prisoners rushed towards the outer perimeter, through the minefields, and just tried to escape. Many were killed by guards or explosions as they fled, but approximately 300 prisoners managed to escape the camp and reach the nearby forests. Tragically, many of the escapees were later recaptured or killed by the Nazis or local collaborators. Of the approximately 300 who escaped, only around 50 to 70 survived the war, including Perchesky, who lived to recount the story. In retaliation, the Nazis closed Sobibor shortly after the uprising. They dismantled the camp, destroyed evidence of its existence, and planted trees over the site in an attempt to erase all traces of what had occurred there. Next up, we have Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park was a British code-breaking center during World War II and one of the most significant locations in the Allied war effort. Located about 50 miles northwest of London, this estate became the nerve center for cracking Germany's secret communications, including the famous Enigma code used by the Nazis. In the late 1930s, as the threat of war with Germany increased, British intelligence began preparing for potential cryptographic challenges. Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion, was purchased by the government in 1938 as a secluded site for intelligence and code-breaking operations. Bletchley Park attracted an unusual mix of experts from various fields, including mathematicians, scholars, linguists, chess champions, and puzzle solvers. The most notable figure would be Alan Turing. He was the most famous codebreaker at Bletchley Park. Turing was a brilliant mathematician and logician who played a critical role in developing techniques to decode the Enigma cipher. His work essentially laid the groundwork for modern computer science. So if you don't know, the Enigma machine was a pretty sophisticated encryption device used by the Germans to send secure military communications. It involved a series of rotors and settings that changed daily, creating an astronomical number of possible combinations. German forces believed the code was unbreakable, as it would take an impractical amount of time for any person to crack it manually. Using insights from captured Enigma machines and with the help from Polish cryptographers who had made early breakthroughs on Enigma, Bletchley Park's codebreakers developed techniques and machinery to decode messages. Turing's bombing machine allowed Bletchley Park to systematically and rapidly break Enigma messages, often deciphering them in near real time. Their work gave the Allies critical insights into German military plans, including naval movements in the Battle of the Atlantic, where decrypted Enigma messages helped prevent devastating losses to German U-boats. In addition to Enigma, Bletchley Park also cracked the Lorentz cipher, used for high-level German communications. The Lorentz cipher was even more complex than Enigma, and breaking it required an entirely different approach. To tackle Lorentz, British engineers developed Colossus, the world's first programmable digital computer, which allowed for faster processing of coded messages. Developed by Tommy Flowers and completed in 1944, Colossus represented a revolutionary step in computing and played a major role in decrypting German communications, particularly from the German High Command. So yeah, Colossus marked the beginning of modern computing and is often regarded as one of the most important technological achievements of World War II. Next up, we've got Carpatho-Ukrainian Independence. Carpatho-Ukrainian Independence is a unique episode in Central European history, marked by the dramatic emergence of an independent state in a turbulent time. Carpatho-Ukraine declared independence on March 15th, 1939, but its sovereignty was short-lived, lasting only a day before it was occupied by Hungarian forces. Carpatho-Ukraine was located in the Carpathian Mountains along the eastern edge of Czechoslovakia. Its population included Ukrainians, Hungarians, Jews, Romanians, and various other ethnic groups. After World War I, Carpatho-Ukraine became part of the newly created Czechoslovakia as an autonomous region called Subcarpathian Rus under the Treaty of Saint-Germain in 1919. During the interwar period, Carpatho-Ukraine enjoyed some degree of self-governance under Czechoslovakia, and local leaders, including some Ukrainian nationalists, began advocating for more autonomy or even full independence. However, the area remained economically underdeveloped, and the question of its national identity was complicated by ethnic and political divisions. Some of its people identified as Ukrainians, others as Russians or Ruthenians, while others still saw themselves as distinct from both Ukrainians and Russians. In the late 1930s, as Nazi Germany destabilized Central Europe, Ukrainian nationalist movements gained traction. After the Munich Agreement in 1938, which ceded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia to Germany, Czechoslovakia began to disintegrate. In October 1938, following German pressure, Prague granted Carpatho-Ukraine increased autonomy within the remaining Czechoslovak Federation. Augustin Voloshin, a pro-Ukrainian priest and political leader, was elected as Prime Minister of the autonomous Carpatho-Ukrainian government. Under his leadership, Ukrainian language, culture, and political identity were promoted, and local leaders began to push for complete independence. On March 14, 1939, Slovakia declared independence from Czechoslovakia, backed by Germany. This led to the final collapse of Czechoslovakia, and Carpatho-Ukraine quickly seized the opportunity to declare its own independence on March 15, 1939. The Carpatho-Ukrainian Republic was proclaimed with Augustin Voloshin as its president. The new government established a flag, anthem, and other national symbols and declared Ukrainian as the official language. The declaration was symbolic of the Carpatho-Ukrainians' desire for self-determination and the larger Ukrainian nationalist movement that had been building in Eastern Europe. However, the state was immediately under threat as Hungary, an ally of Nazi Germany, sought to expand its territory by reclaiming Carpatho-Ukraine. Almost as soon as Carpatho-Ukraine declared its independence, Hungarian forces launched an invasion. Hungary, which had already gained parts of southern Slovakia through the First Vienna Award, now set its sight on Carpatho-Ukraine. The Carpatho-Ukrainian government attempted to mobilize a small military defense force, the Carpathian Sich, but they were poorly armed, outnumbered, and obviously under-resourced. The Hungarian forces quickly overran Carpatho-Ukraine, and by March 16, 1939, Hungarian troops had seized control of the region. The brief Carpatho-Ukrainian Republic fell after only 1 day of independence, with its leaders either fleeing, going into hiding, or being captured by Hungarian forces. So yeah, that's about it. Next up, we've got Operation Tannenbaum. Operation Tannenbaum, which is German for Operation Christmas Tree, was the codename for a planned Nazi invasion of Switzerland during World War II. So, as everybody probably already knows, Switzerland maintained a policy of strict neutrality during World War II. It was surrounded by Axis-controlled or Axis-aligned nations. Switzerland was effectively encircled by hostile forces. While Switzerland's geographical position was a strategic interest to Germany, the Swiss Alps also provided a formidable natural defense. Additionally, Switzerland had a well-trained and organized military for a nation of its size, supported by a network of fortifications, including bunkers and defensive positions in the Alps. The Swiss government and military prepared extensively to defend the country in the event of a German invasion. Switzerland's defensive strategy, known as the National Redoubt, was designed to retreat key military units and government officials into the mountains, where they could resist occupation for as long as possible. After Nazi Germany's swift victories in Poland, Norway, and France, German high command looked toward Switzerland, with several German leaders proposing an invasion to secure German influence over the neutral country. Detailed plans for Operation Tannenbaum were drafted in June 1940, following the successful German invasion of France and the establishment of the Vichy regime. The initial planning was led by General Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, who was tasked with organizing the potential invasion. Von Lieb proposed an attack force of 300,000 troops, a substantial force that was deemed necessary to overcome Switzerland's mountainous defenses and strong military tradition. Over time, the plans were actually scaled down. German high command revised Operation Tannenbaum, reducing the planned invasion force to around 100,000 soldiers instead, likely because the German military was becoming stretched with campaigns elsewhere. The Swiss military, though small, was formidable and well prepared, which led the Germans to be cautious about committing a large force. Additionally, German strategists estimated that an invasion of Switzerland would be very costly and would tie down forces that were definitely needed elsewhere on the other fronts. The Swiss military mobilized hundreds of thousands of soldiers and implemented defensive plans focusing on the mountainous terrain that made an invasion logistically very challenging. So yeah, despite the detailed planning, Operation Tannenbaum was never carried out. It was due to the strategic costs, economic cooperation, intelligence and diplomatic interests, and obviously by 1940, the overextended German forces. Next up is comfort women. The term comfort women refers to women and girls who were forced into slavery by the Japanese military before and during World War II. This system of exploitation took place throughout Japanese-occupied territories, including Korea, China, the Philippines, Taiwan, Indonesia, and other countries in Southeast Asia. The comfort women system began in the early 1930s around the time of Japan's invasion of Manchuria. As Japan expanded its empire across Asia, military leaders sought ways to maintain the morale of soldiers and prevent what they called uncontrolled acts of sexual violence against civilians. The solution was to set up military-run brothels, euphemistically referred to as comfort stations, where soldiers could seek services in a regulated setting. However, these comfort stations were staffed by forcibly recruited, abducted, or deceived women. Japanese military authorities and private contractors used deceptive promises of work, abductions, and in many cases, just outright violence to coerce women into these roles. Although a small number of Japanese women were involved, the vast majority of comfort women came from occupied countries, particularly Korea. Obviously a terrible thing, so not going to dive too deep into it. So, moving on. Aktion T4. Aktion T4 was the Nazi regime's program of systematic murder targeting individuals with disabilities whom they deemed unworthy of life. Named after its headquarters in Berlin, Aktion T4 was part of the Nazis' broader ideology of racial purity and social Darwinism. This program marked one of the earliest instances of systematic state-sponsored mass killings by the Nazi regime, predating and laying the groundwork for the Holocaust. The roots of Aktion T4 lie in the Nazi ideology that classified people with physical and mental disabilities as life unworthy of life. The Nazis saw individuals with disabilities as burdens on society, deeming them economically unproductive and genetically inferior. This thinking was influenced by social Darwinism and eugenics, which promoted the idea of improving the human race by eliminating undesirable genetic traits. The so-called euthanasia program began with Hitler's authorization, signed in October 1939. Hitler's order empowered Nazi officials and doctors to begin systematically killing individuals with disabilities under the guise of mercy killing or euthanasia. Aktion T4 targeted people with a wide range of disabilities, including physical and mental illnesses, intellectual disabilities, schizophrenia, epilepsy, and many other conditions. The program initially focused on children, but soon expanded to include adults in institutional care. The Nazis set up a process for identifying, transferring, and ultimately killing these individuals. Man, this episode has been brutal. Can we get, not this stuff? Jeez. Next on the list, we have the unfinished portrait of FDR. The unfinished portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt is an iconic painting that captures the last moments of President FDR's life. It was started on April 12, 1945, the day of his death. This portrait remained unfinished, symbolizing the abrupt end of Roosevelt's leadership during a critical juncture in American and world history. Painted by artist Elizabeth Shalmatoff, the unfinished portrait is not only a unique piece of American history, but also a reminder of FDR's enduring influence. In early 1945, Roosevelt was declining in health. The stress of leading the United States through the Great Depression and most of World War II, combined with his battle with polio, had visibly weakened him. Still, Roosevelt remained deeply involved in planning for the post-war world, including laying the groundwork for the United Nations. After his return from the Yalta Conference in February, FDR went to his Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, a place he often visited to seek therapeutic relief for his polio symptoms. On April 12, 1945, Elizabeth Shalmatoff, a Russian-American portrait artist, arrived at Warm Springs to paint Roosevelt's portrait. Shalmatoff was well known for her skill in portraiture and had been recommended by mutual friends. Roosevelt was seated in his favorite chair, wearing a light suit and a blue tie, looking relaxed as the session began. During the painting session, Roosevelt complained of a severe headache, saying, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head." Moments later, he collapsed from what was later determined to be a massive stroke. Medical staff rushed to help, but the president was pronounced dead that afternoon at the age of 63. Shalmatoff was left with an incomplete painting, a partially finished portrait of a man who had just died. The unfinished portrait captures FDR in a moment of calm, seated in a relaxed posture with a gentle expression. The painting was left with only the head and shoulders partially completed. Chalmatoff had started with a focus on Roosevelt's face, leaving other elements of the composition unrefined. After Roosevelt's death, Elizabeth Chalmatoff returned to her studio and created a second version of the portrait from memory, completing it as she had originally envisioned. This finished portrait shows Roosevelt in the same pose with the same colors and expression, but obviously rendered in full. This version is even sometimes displayed alongside the unfinished original. Today, the unfinished portrait is displayed at the Little White House Historic Site in Warm Springs, Georgia, where Roosevelt spent his final hours. Next up, Axis Sally. Axis Sally was the nickname given to Mildred Gillers, an American woman who broadcast Nazi propaganda to Allied troops during the war. Gillers, who became one of the most notorious figures of propaganda, worked under the Third Reich's broadcasting arm, sending demoralizing messages intended to weaken the morale of American soldiers. Her work obviously earned her infamy, and after the war, she became the first woman tried and convicted of treason in the United States. Mildred Gillers was born on November 29, 1900, in Portland, Maine. She spent her early years in the United States and eventually traveled to Europe in the 1930s. She eventually settled in Germany, where she found work as an English language teacher and then as a radio broadcaster. She struggled to find stable employment and initially had no strong political affiliation or loyalty to the Nazi Party. As Germany prepared for war, Gillers found herself in an interesting position. She didn't want to go back to the United States because they were in the middle of the Great Depression. So in the 1940s, she began working for the RRG, which is Germany's state-controlled radio station. She was then later recruited to broadcast Nazi propaganda, targeting Allied soldiers under the direction of Max Otto Koischwitz, a German-American and former professor at Hunter College in New York, who was also involved in Nazi broadcasting. Under the moniker of Axis Sally, Gillers became the voice of Nazi propaganda aimed at American soldiers. Her broadcasts were intended to demoralize Allied troops by spreading misinformation, highlighting Allied losses, and sowing seeds of doubt and mistrust. Funny enough, the actual effect of her propaganda on American troops was extremely limited. Most soldiers viewed Axis Sally as a curiosity rather than a legitimate source of news, and her broadcasts were often served as a source of humor or distraction rather than demoralization. Allied soldiers were generally well aware that Axis Sally's broadcasts were propaganda and, for the most part, did not even take her seriously. After the war, she was arrested in Berlin in 1946 and extradited to the United States to face charges of treason. Her trial began in 1949 and drew significant public attention. The prosecution argued that Gillers had willingly aided the enemy by participating in Nazi propaganda efforts and broadcasting messages designed to weaken the morale of American soldiers. One of the key pieces of evidence in her trial was the Vision of Invasion broadcast, which was seen as directly aimed at demoralizing American troops. Gillers maintained that she had been coerced and claimed that she had acted out of fear rather than true loyalty to the Nazi cause. However, the jury found her explanations unconvincing, and she was convicted of treason on March 8, 1949. Gillers was sentenced to 10 to 30 years in prison and a $10,000 fine. She served her sentence at the Federal Reformatory for Women in Alderson, West Virginia, and was paroled after 12 years in 1961. After her release, she joined a convent in Ohio, where she lived a quiet life out of the public eye, occasionally teaching language and music. Before we move on, I did the math on $10,000 in 1949, and that's about $132,607 today. So yeah, up next, cargo cults. Cargo cults are religious or social movements that emerged primarily in Melanesia after encounters with technologically advanced Western societies during or after World War II. These movements revolve around the belief that material wealth, or cargo, was a divine gift meant for the indigenous populations but had been appropriated by foreigners. The term cargo cult describes the ritual beliefs that developed in these societies as they tried to summon the cargo through imitating Western practices, sometimes taking on unique and elaborate forms. So, let me explain. The origins of the cargo cult can be traced to the sudden appearance of Western goods like radios, medicine, canned food, clothing, and even machinery brought by European explorers, missionaries, and later by American and Japanese military personnel during the war. For many indigenous people, these goods represented wealth and power beyond anything that they had previously experienced, but they didn't actually understand any of the manufacturing or how they were made or what they even did. So when Allied forces began to establish bases in the Pacific during World War II, they brought vast quantities of cargo for the troops. To the local islanders, these supplies appeared to arrive miraculously, often delivered by airplanes from the sky or unloaded from large ships. Indigenous people who had not been exposed to industrial production saw the goods as a type of magical or divine provision. In response to this, some Melanesian communities developed rituals and beliefs intended to attract more of this valuable cargo, viewing the goods as a manifestation of ancestral or divine gifts that Westerners had somehow seized control of. In response to this, some Melanesian communities developed rituals and beliefs intended to attract more of this valuable cargo, viewing the goods as a manifestation of ancestral or divine gifts that Westerners had somehow seized control of. Many cargo cults held that their ancestor or deities had sent the goods as blessings to their communities, but Westerns actually intercepted these gifts. The cult followers believed that through rituals they can restore the natural order and receive the cargo directly. In an effort to attract the cargo, the cult followers sometimes mimicked the activities and behaviors they observed among Westerners. This has included constructing makeshift airstrips, building replica airplanes, and creating wooden radios or control towers, all in the hope of summoning the cargo. Some cargo cults predicted that there was a spiritual leader or messianic figure that would return to bring cargo directly to the people. In some cases, historical figures or even prominent Americans such as John Frum in Vanuatu or Tom Navy in New Guinea were believed to be divine beings or messengers who will return with cargo. So yeah, I mean, just imagine you're in an untouched tribe in the Amazon or something, and you see an airplane. I mean, it would be insane. But just kind of a quirky little story. Japan and USSR still at war. So the idea that Japan and the Soviet Union are still at war stems from an unresolved territorial dispute and the fact that, unlike most other World War II combatants, Japan and the Soviet Union never signed a formal peace treaty to officially end hostilities. Although the two countries normalized relations in 1956 and have not engaged in military conflict since the war, a long-standing disagreement over the Kuril Islands have prevented the signing of a final peace treaty to formally conclude World War II between them. Japan and the Soviet Union signed a neutrality pact in 1941, agreeing not to attack each other as both were preoccupied with separate conflicts, Japan in the Pacific and the Soviet Union in Europe. However, by 1945, with the war in Europe nearing an end, the Allied powers sought to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan. In February 1945, during the Yalta Conference, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat in exchange for territorial concessions in East Asia. On August 8, 1945, just days after the bombing of Hiroshima and 1 day before the Nagasaki bombing, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive offensive in Manchuria, attacking Japanese forces in Manchuria, the Korean Peninsula, and the Kuril Islands. The swift invasion led to Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, and the signing of formal surrender documents on September 2, 1945. However, the surrender was directed primarily at the Allied forces, especially the US, and did not address the Soviet Union specifically. That, combined with the fact that the Soviet Union does not exist anymore, pretty much means that the Soviet Union and Japan are still at war. So yeah. And finally, Helmuth Hubener. Helmuth Hubener was a German teenager who became one of the youngest resistance fighters executed by the Nazi regime during World War II. Born on January 8, 1925 in Hamburg, Germany, Hubener grew up in a working-class family and was an active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, which is the LDS Church. As a young teenager, Hubener was compelled to join the Hitler Youth, a mandatory organization for all German youth under Nazi rule. However, he quickly grew disillusioned with the organization and its ideology after witnessing the brutality of Kristallnacht in 1938, a violent pogrom against the Jewish communities. Disgusted by the Nazi regime's racist policies and oppressive control, Hubener began to see through the propaganda that surrounded him, feeling an internal conflict between what he was taught at church and what the Nazi state expected him to believe. In 1941, at just 16 years old, Hubener began listening to forbidden BBC radio broadcasts where he heard uncensored news that exposed the lies of the Nazi propaganda. Disturbed by the realities of the war and the deceit propagated by his government, he decided to take action. Using a typewriter at his local church, Hubener began composing anti-Nazi leaflets, aiming to inform the German public about the true state of the war and the atrocities committed by the regime. He enlisted the help of 3 friends to distribute these leaflets across Hamburg, often placing them in public areas where passerby could pick them up. The leaflets criticized Hitler and the Nazi leadership, calling for Germans to question the information given by their government and to resist the propaganda machine. In February 1942, Hubener's resistance activities came to an end when a coworker found one of his leaflets and reported it to the authorities. Hubener and his friends were arrested by the Gestapo and endured brutal interrogations. Despite the torture, Hubener took full responsibility for the leaflets, hoping to protect his friends from severe punishment. On August 11, 1942, he was tried before the People's Court, which was a Nazi-run court notorious for its fatal judgments against political dissidents. He was charged with high treason and furthering the enemy's cause, crimes for which the Nazis showed no mercy. Despite his youth, Hubener was sentenced to death, and his friends received lengthy prison sentences instead of capital punishment, largely due to Hubener's efforts to shield them. Well, that wraps up today's episode. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. If you're not already subscribed, consider doing so. I love to see it. Helps me out a ton. But otherwise, see you in the next episode.